Exodus. Here, I'm going to get my book here. I forgot. I'm going to preach it. All right. There he goes. Nice coffee. All right, so anyways, this book, Exodus, Night of Redemption. I've been reading this the last couple of months. I don't even remember now. I don't know how many people have actually been able to finish it. I found it to be a good perspective. It was helpful. I always wondered about the picture. It was interesting that he entitled it Night of Redemption, where I felt like it was definitely a process. It was more than just a night, certainly, right? But I found it like I enjoyed the book. So we're going to be finishing out here in Exodus 34 to 40. So it's a sizable chunk. Quite a bit to cover, lots of great lessons though in Exodus, things to think through regarding the journey that the Israelites were on with God. And in many ways, I think this was a time where they were still forming their faith, and they had been in Egypt for 400 odd years. Their forefathers had come to Egypt initially to escape a famine, right? But in retrospect, we would say that God protected them and multiplied them on the backs of the Egyptians. But they didn't know that. And, God might, for them, it's not clear to me, but God might have been a distant past promises, right? That they, for previous generations that at this point maybe became bedtime stories for the kids. Like, it's not clear to me after 400 years where the Israelites really at in their faith, right? And they're obviously being oppressed by that point. But the time came when God was moving on to the next part of his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from so many generations before. They're going to be moving on to the promised land. Moses had been a key figure during this entire book of Exodus, and starting with his birth, moving through his midlife mishaps, right, and other occurrences, and finally being singled out as God's man for the job. And I think also in the same light, I kind of wonder for Moses, where did he get to know God? Right? Because, as far as I can tell, he was born into a Hebrew family very quickly, was not in that same Hebrew family, but then reinserted into that same Hebrew family, at least until he was weaned, which I'm not clear on what that is, but let's say 4 years old, 5 years, I don't know how long it lasted. Right? So he might have had minimal understanding of God, or at least the traditions of the Hebrews, before he got moved on to living in Pharaoh's household, at which he was then probably educated in ways of the Egyptians in their religions, right? So I'm not really sure what he had. And so in this way, Moses was also experiencing, maybe for the first time, a journey of getting to know God. And he needed that same time to build trust that God was going to have his back no matter what, and was the one fully in control, even when things didn't seem under control, like many times when he was standing before Pharaoh, probably, right? It's probably kind of scary. But it's pretty much how I feel on my journey, how my journey has been, and maybe all of us for that matter, I'm not sure. We're just building trust through experiencing God through the Bible and seeing his character displayed. And the journey effectively takes a lifetime, so you never really arrive at knowing all there is to know about God, right? So we're all going to be on this journey until we're not on the journey. I don't know. I don't think it really ends, right? At the beginning of Exodus, we see the Israelites themselves didn't seem to be coming from a position of active worship when Moses first brings them the good news. They're kind of like, this sounds great. We don't really know much about God. That was the way I kind of read this. They're rusty in their knowledge, but all of a sudden they're hopeful, right? That something could change in their circumstances. The long way around journey to the promised land took them through times of hope and fear, anger, weariness, bitterness, sin, and maybe them back to hope. In no specific order. And God himself had been rolling with their imperfections. The imperfections of their obedience as the relationship formed. So it was not this perfect, like, you are my people, here we go, everything's hunky-dory. It was a work in process, right? And which I think is important for us to look at too, in our own walk with God, right? Work in progress. And we've read through and discussed the first 33 chapters roughly so far. Today we'll be looking, like I said, from 34 to 40. The last 6 chapters contain quite a bit of detail on the instructions that God gave Moses and the execution of those details. pretty much too much in there for one short sermon. It's not exactly all the somebody so-and-so begot so-and-so, and those type of long things, but it's not that much different where, you could get lost in the details there and gloss over it a little bit. But, I think that the one thing, the real meat that I wanted to talk about was just the focus on the obedience, despite all the disobedience and, if you will, like not really living up to things previously, but the obedience that Moses and the Israelites did succeed in these final few chapters, right? And as a quick side note, again, back to this, I think it was the very last chapter in here, but Douglas Jacoby had he'd written something that I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about, but why God led the Israelites through the wilderness route. I had some thoughts on that, but I was a geography major in college, but I'm pretty sure I cannot draw you a good map of the Middle East. I mean, yeah, I couldn't do it. And so I have an idea of where Egypt is, and there's the Nile River, it dumps into the Mediterranean, right? And then there's like kind of a swing up there. So I kind of got the general idea, but the whole desert route into the Sinai Peninsula, or that whole chunk, that's a big area. And I don't really know, but if we traced it, like if we knew exactly where they went, was it like a squiggly line? Because that area is it's pretty desolate, and it's, for a large group of people, it feels very hard to move them through some of those areas. It's like they didn't have four-wheel drive. They were climbing, they were going up, down, so they were there for a long time. But I think that Jacoby estimated that, and to back up, there seemed to be a coastal trade route that was a bit more of an established direct shot to the Promised Land, right? If they had kind of hugged the coast, wasn't as far, right? And so, but that's not where God took them. Jacoby estimated that could have taken a month or so if they just were right there. And, maybe a few years, even if they did, which they did go through the wilderness route, that might have only taken a few years to go that route. But it took 40 years. So there was something going on there. And I don't think the Israelites necessarily enjoyed that whole time. It wasn't like party in the desert, right? It was, if you think of putting yourself in that journey, I don't know what you carried out of Egypt, but you get really tired of eating, whatever they brought with them. It became very clear that God needed to take care of them where they were at. Like they were not, finding a lot of cool, gourmet meals out there in the desert. God was taking care of them. And even if they did go along the coastal route, I think that, they still had the problem of the different peoples that were there that they would end up having to fight. They ended up needing to fight some of those same peoples once they got to the Promised Land. So I think the real thing here, and Jacoby had mentioned that, was ultimately it was sin that kind of kept the Israelites circling in the desert, so to say. And I also went back and I reviewed, because I could remember it, but I had to look it up, in Genesis 15, when God promised Abraham about his descendants in the Promised Land. God seemed to have a timer on how long he was going to put up with the other nations who occupied the Promised Land. Because he said something about the sin of the Amorites, those people were in that area, had not come to a fullness. So it seemed like God was being patient with the peoples in that land, as parallel kind of stories going on. So a couple things there, but regardless, the time in the wilderness, I think, ended up being a time of testing and training and learning about their new relationship with God. Very much again, like how many of us came to God. God knew best, desired that his chosen people would willingly choose him for the long haul. He knows how we're formed. He's probably not surprised that the people were not perfect with obedience. And we see them commit to the covenant with God, but they quickly waver on that commitment. I think that was around chapter 32. And I don't know how many years that was into it, but there had been previous incidents where the people were unhappy and God was getting mad, right? So it wasn't the first time, but we had we talked about this last week with the golden calf. Ultimately it was this problem of sin. And I think our lives have many similar parallels when it comes to sin. Whether it's like big bags or little carry-ons of sin, mean, I know I've carried a lot more baggage than I should have or needed to for over the years, and it's been nice to let go of that. God has let me let go of some of those things over the years, and I appreciate that. And it seems like the Israelites were on that same type of journey. I'm just kind of curious here, we'll open it up real quick as a question, but what are some of the aspects of the story about the faith journey of the Israelites in the wilderness that have helped you in your personal faith? I'm just kind of curious. Anybody be willing to voice up aspects of the story about the faith journey of the Israelites while they're in the wilderness that help you in your faith journey? Peter.
Well, I mean, as you're talking, one thing that reminds me is that God was leading them where they went in the desert, like they followed the palm of smoke, day and the fire at night. And so sometimes God leads you to places you don't want to go, for durations you don't want to be there for. So to me, it helps you realize that things aren't always, as we say, Pollyanna. It's not always awesome, but sometimes the difficult times are what really along the have a different payoff. So, sometimes it's temporary. You walk with God, helps you to be stronger and more faithful.
Sure. Yeah, sometimes the trials themselves produce the perseverance that God wants you to get to eventually.
Where God is leading you from, that's the big lesson, is that, this trial is not a Satan thing necessarily. It's God's allowing it to happen.
Yeah, for higher purposes.
Yeah. I feel good.
Anybody else? Well, I think that as we come into the final chapters, having had chapter 32 end in a disappointing plot twist of the golden calf, I think we discussed last week that today our golden calves that take us away from God can be things like sin, but also work, entertainment, relationships, hobbies, and then lots of things, probably a long list. We think about all the tangible distractions. And I think in some ways that's what the Israelites were maybe looking for, is like, we need something tangible. That's what we had in Egypt, whether it was right or wrong. It was tangible, more tangible for them. I thought it was interesting that potentially they're still in view of, like Moses had gone up on Sinai during the golden calf incident, so they could probably see the storm cloud, everything's happening right there. And they're like, well, we don't really know what happened. So we'll do our thing down here. But they can still see that something's happened up there with God, But anyways, I think that might have been something that I could relate to as well. It's just sometimes it's easy to pursue the tangible, just because of comfort, maybe, or just something feels maybe a little more sure. Anyways, I found that in my life. But I think that the Israelites had seen the great power of God, and it was displayed in them getting out of Egypt. But they definitely backslid here. And Moses was gone just for a short period of time, but they quickly realized their mistake. And what was it? The plague. There was a plague that came on them, and several thousand people were put to death. And so they learned that sin has real consequences through that. And God was angry. He told Moses that he was going to destroy the people instead, and then just start again with Moses, like fresh. That's a pretty big statement for him to put on Moses, like, I've decided we're going to abandon this plan. We're just going to go with you. We'll start again with you. And Moses was like, I think that this part here also, God was saying, go on ahead. He basically from that, God was saying, go on ahead without me. You're on your own. I'll send an angel to clear a path, but frankly, I'm feeling like I'll destroy you if I go with you. So there we go. And the people are just going, no, we're like, now we're okay. And then they come back down to reality, like, what have we done? A big whoopsie moment. And they'd seen what God had done to the Egyptians, so it wasn't like an empty threat. Like, they knew God had the power to back it up. But I feel like this was less on the punishment side. They had already felt the sting of that, but maybe more on the perceived abandonment. Like, God's not going to go with us. What do you mean? We're out in the middle of the desert. We're in the middle of nowhere, on the way. And like, God's abandoning us. I don't know if that's what they felt, but that's what I might feel from that. And then even Moses was now unsure of the plan and told God, he's like, God, if you're unwilling to go with us, I don't want to go either. Like, we don't want to go without you. but there wasn't. It just didn't seem like there was a backup plan. I mean, like they'd already kind of complained and grumbled a few times about food issues and stuff like that, water, just comforts. Like, hey, we had all this great stuff back in Egypt. We just go back there. I was really comfortable, forgetting that they were slaves, right? But it was they didn't have a backup plan, and the only way forward was with God, and I think at this point they knew it. So they had this time in the desert, the 40 years, that had gotten to the point where, despite temporary setbacks and failures, they knew the way forward was with God. But I love, even in the face of all this, we see the compassion of God win out over anger. And we read in Exodus 33, not even 34 yet, we read in Exodus 33 in verse 7 that there was the tent of meeting outside of the camp, and they had brought this with them the whole journey. And they've been taking this down, setting it up the whole time, so I mean, they must have. We used to have a tent here, and we had a couple tents, and in the early days of our fellowship here, we had definitely a crew that would set up a tent, and it was a drag at times, frankly. So well, I get this, like it feels very personal. Like if I was in charge of setting up the tent of meeting, I'd be like, like, all right, let's grab the 350-pound tent, drag it out in the rain, and set it up, and chairs, and, like they had done this for years at this point, and dragged this thing all over the desert. But it does seem in verse 7, it seems that anyone who wanted to inquire of the Lord could go to the tent, or at least make the inquiry for Moses to bring to the tent to talk to God. So God was accessible to them through Moses. And up to this point, since the tabernacle had not been completed, this is where, most importantly, it was where Moses would meet with God as he represented the people. And they respected this meeting place because it records that they would stand up in front of their tents, almost like stand at attention. I'm not really exactly sure, but there was still awe of God. I mean, the cloud is in front of the tent during the day, fire at night. There's still something going on where they at least have that awe and respect of God going forward. So it must have been quite a sight to see, I'm guessing. But I do love in verse 15, in chapter 33, it says, "The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend." And this might, I'm thinking this is only kind of an expression because I don't believe Moses actually ever did see God's face. But my take on this is how God would prefer to talk to us. Right? And with full respect for who he is, but for us, we get to experience the trust that one has in a close friendship. Somebody who has your best intentions in mind will stand up for you, be with you on your journey no matter what comes. You get to talk to a friend. And that's, I think, has become over the years much more important to me as I've grown in my relationship with God. And then Moses said to him, as a friend, "If your presence does not go with us, don't send us up from here. How will anyone know if you are pleased with me and all your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" And the Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you and know you by name." So did Moses have the ear of God in these circumstances? Yeah. I mean, this one request by Moses probably changed the history that we read about right now. Like, if God said no, what would that mean? Like, what the whole trajectory of the Bible might have changed if he said, "Yeah, no, I'm not going to go." Like, it seems like Moses was able to persuade God, like, "Please be with us. We want your presence." And I think we would all say that we want to be pleasing God simply because it feels like that's the right side of the equation. But just a question for us to think about is, do you feel that God knows you by name?
Yes.
The God of the universe. Thank you, yes. The God of the universe. How does this make you feel? Anybody want to answer that question?
Very special.
Special?
Insulated.
Insulated, I like that word. Yeah, protected maybe? Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like there's probably a lot more to uncover here with what's in a name, or certainly the Bible kind of sometimes makes it's a big thing for God's name, right? Or I mean, I got a random name because of I think a TV character from my parents that they liked the show or something like that. So that was where mine came from. But I think that God knowing me by name just indicates an intimacy that God desires. So I think that's cool. Well, where else might we also read about God's promise to be with us on our faith journey? Anybody have any ideas of where else in the Bible that we can read that? Jeanette? Oh, yes, Matthew 28. Jesus says that he promises to be with us always to the very end of the age. I had also thought, Peter, yes?
On 17, where he said they want to call you servants and
Friends. Yeah, Jesus calls us friends.
Look at Joshua. He promises Joshua, he says, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you.
Yep. Joshua. I was thinking of in Psalms where David basically writes like, where can I go to get away from you? Like he was acknowledging, he was like, there's nowhere I can even escape you. You are everywhere with me. And I'm like, well, if you're trying to get away from God, that's a little discouraging, right? You're like, I can't get away. But if you're like not wanting to get away, you're like, that's pretty cool. Nowhere that I am, like you won't be with me. God can always be with you if you desire it. And we're not alone unless we decide to be, right? It's kind of encouraging that we will never be left alone as long as we are desiring God to be with us. But anyways, let's start. So, anybody have a timer? Am I like 50 minutes into the sermon? All right. So, we were going to talk about Exodus 34 to 40, but it's happily there's not a ton in there that I'm going to pull out. So, a couple things that I wanted to look at were Exodus 34. This is the second set of stone tablets that were made, I believe, and 10 Commandments written. God spoke to Moses for 40 days, 40 nights. So pretty sure all that was said could not fit on 2 stone tablets. So Moses must have taken quite a bit of this in his head and related back all those details that we would read about. That was pretty much out of his head, assuming he didn't have reams and reams of parchment that he took up on the mountain with him. So lots that God had to say, lots that Moses came back and told people about the detailed expectations and commandments of God. But I think that there's a continuing theme found in verses 6 to 7. It says, the Lord, and this is God speaking, the Lord is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, rich in faithful love and truth, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving wrongdoing, rebellion, and sin. But he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the consequences of the father's wrongdoing on the children and grandchildren to the 3rd and 4th generation. Oftentimes, the first part of that statement could be read and the second part left off, but I think it's important to see that God is fair. Sin does have lasting effects, like ripples of a stone thrown in the water, right? It's the sins of our fathers could potentially still be affecting us. Not that that's what God wanted for us. But Exodus 34:8, Moses bowed to the ground at once and worshipped. Lord, he said, if I have found favor in your eyes, then go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, forgive our wickedness and our sin, and take us as your inheritance. I often think about God being my inheritance, like at the end of my life journey, right? That's kind of the goal, right? That was a concept introduced to me a long time ago. That's been hard for me to wrap my head around, but I kind of get it. God is what I'm getting, and I'm like, I want that. So, and someday, sometimes it feels like a someday thing. Other times I feel like I've achieved it. I got it. God is here with me, right? And so but that's not actually what it says, or what Moses said. He said, "Take us as your inheritance." So, I feel valued by God and see that value demonstrated by what Jesus did for us. But I haven't really considered that I would be like a valuable enough asset, I guess, maybe, to be God's inheritance. Like, is God waiting, like, before the end to, like, yay, I inherit Rob? I'm like, oh, sorry, bud. But that's what I feel like. Am I really all that great to be waiting to inherit me? I don't know what Moses was saying here, but something different to think about. And elsewhere in the scriptures, it talks about being God's treasured possession. So I feel like there are elements of that here in the Bible that I already talk about. Sometimes I'm just grateful that I'm here. God keeps me around, puts up with me. And I wrote down here, it says, could it be that you, little old you, are what God looks forward to? So if you could personalize this for a second. Little old you, God's looking forward to you as his inheritance. Remove all the people in the room for a second, just you. You're his inheritance. What does that make you feel? How awesome is that? All right. Exodus chapters 35 through 36. I'm blowing through it here. Details. Everybody who was willing and whose heart moved them came and brought an offering to the Lord for the work of the tent of the meeting, for all its service, and for the sacred garments. So this pattern actually continued daily until at some point the craftsmen and women working on the tabernacle ended up with more than they needed. They had to ask, like, please stop. We have too much. So it's a good problem to have. They had, hey, stop bringing the gold and silver. Hey, stop, bringing all the fancy fabrics and everything that we had requested. We have enough. We have enough for God's work. This was maybe a change in the Israelites' attitude, possibly. But it's a good change. They're heading in the right direction for that. And it wasn't, I think it was a good question for me. Am I desiring to keep giving in the Lord's service as I continue in my faith journey? Sometimes you can get tired, right? And then specifically, not out of compulsion, because in this particular case, it was a free will offering. And they just got dunked on by the people, all the stuff that they had requested. So it came from the heart. So what made them move on from the golden calf incident to this? And I think that's their overall time with God is starting to produce in them an understanding of his consistent character and love for them. It's taking a little bit of time, but they're seeing it. They're starting to see it. And they're responding. And I think it was interesting as well that when you tally up the weight of the precious metals and the bronze used, it was over 15,000 pounds that went into it for the tabernacle. So, they must have had this, individually. They carried it throughout the desert for 40 years, and then when they put it all in one spot, some unlucky bunch that now gets to be like, yeah, that thing weighs 450 pounds, So now they're carrying that, right? But it was a big effort. Starting in chapter 39, we start to see a pattern, and it was a good pattern. The phrase, just as the Lord had commanded, starts to repeat as they fabricate and execute God's instructions for the tabernacle. It was 8 times in chapter 39. And then again in chapter 40, a repetition of the phrase, just as the Lord had commanded, 8 times. Again, while the Israelites were still a ways from reaching the promised land, because they still have to go through a good chunk of Leviticus, and I don't know exactly at what point they have arrived, right? So there's still maybe a ways out here at the end of Exodus. It's not like they just arrived at the promised land at the end of Exodus, per se. But their understanding and obedience here was, I think, commendable, and God was evidently pleased. So, but in Exodus 40, in verses 33 through 38, and so Moses finished the work. Then the cloud covered the tent of the meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of the meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and the fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the Israelites during all their travels. And so the book of Exodus finishes here with just visibility, kind of calling out the visibility or presence of God with Israel. So he made his dwelling among them. That was kind of a stated goal. How did they know God was with them? They could look at the tabernacle. You got a cloud, or fire at night. It was right there. Right? God was with them. And I think for us today, our parallel is that we can also look to the tabernacle at any time for God's reassuring presence. And I'll explain that in a second. But I think so I don't keep flapping my gums, I wanted to play just a quick clip from the Bible project that many of us know, and see somebody else's take on this. And it may or may not line up with what I thought, but I thought it was interesting. And then we'll finish out with just a final thought.
The book of Exodus. In the first video, we explored chapters 1 through 8, which tell the foundational story, how God
I'm
rested.
going to try to get that on the Bluetooth speaker. Hang on. How many people actually finish the book? Is that a bad question to ask in a church service? I did finish it. It's a little bit starting to edge out of memory, but I did like it. It would be something I think I go back to. There are definitely some thoughts in there that I had not thinking of before, so that was I thought it was really useful.
The book of Exodus.
We have sound. All right, go Microsoft. Maybe power it down, power it back on. I was thinking that maybe I would, try to attempt this on my own, but my stick figures were poor. The tabernacle looked like a doghouse. It just, wasn't coming. It didn't feel very inspiring. So. It may not come to pass. All right, well, I'm going to move on just so we don't. That's all right. We'll go back. It starts playing behind me. I'll stop. I just wanted to kind of close out here in John chapter 1, verses 14 through 18. And it's something that I think we're all familiar with. Thanks, guys. Let's see if we get it. So in John 1, verses 14, it starts with, "The Word became flesh and took up residence among us. We observed his glory, the glory of the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him and exclaimed, 'This is the one of whom I said, the one coming after me has surpassed me, because he existed before me.' Indeed, we have received grace after grace from his fullness. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The one and only Son, the one who is at the Father's side, has revealed him." And something I had not known prior to this, in this scripture, but that word dwelt, it depends on your translation. The word became flesh and dwelt among us, or dwells among us, or resides among us, took up residence among us. All of those, anyone know what that Greek word is there? Peter knows. But do you know what it is? Yeah. What is it? Tabernacle. So I didn't know that. So, Jesus is effectively, has taken on that significance there. Jesus being our tabernacle. And that's why I was kind of saying, like, our parallel is we can still look to the tabernacle. We're not looking to the tent of the meeting with the cloud of fire during the day and the column of, what I said wrong, the cloud during the day and the fire at night. But we can still look to the tabernacle today, and that's Jesus. And also, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Hear that at Christmas, maybe, like God with us again. Jesus, being the full representation of God, dwelt among his people. God's full intention, his plan all along, his plan for our redemption and his inheritance was brought to fruition in Jesus. Just as Moses acted as the mediator between God and the Israelites in Exodus, Jesus is now God's perfect mediator for us. And Jesus, through his sacrifice, provides a new and a direct way for us to approach God. So no longer do we depend on a man or a structure or a process for mediation. God gave us his Son. He calls us family. He calls us friends. God inserts himself into the problem of sin. And this would have been something that was mentioned in the video. At the end of the video, you can watch, I would recommend you watch this, the Bible Project. It was the last, I think it was the one that was on thebibleproject.com, the last part of Exodus. But they actually say, at the end of Exodus, we have the problem of sin, and Leviticus is going to be where we solve it. Right? And so I was like, Well, I think that actually the full solution didn't come about until we got to Jesus. So we see that it was like basically a partial solution. Stupid stuff. We see there was a partial solution maybe at the end of Exodus, but Jesus was God's final solution. God makes it his purpose to live among his people, and he draws nearer and nearer throughout human history. And the new covenant through faith in Jesus offers a more personal and intimate relationship with God because it resides within the heart through free will and gratitude. And our new promised land that Jesus is leading us to is already accessible. It's a relationship with God, which is we can have now, and one in which we are clean and unblemished before him. And then just to close out here in Revelations 21, again, I love seeing the consistent theme throughout the Bible. You know, we're kind of Exodus, we're kind of at the beginning, right? We're still near the beginning of the Bible, but in Revelations, towards the very end of the Bible, in chapter 21, verse 3, it says, "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and will be their God.'" At the very end of the Bible, a statement of what God wanted the entire time. And so, if anything today, that's kind of what I want to leave you guys with. It's just God's intent that we can see through the book of Exodus, through what he did with Moses, through the people of Israel and their experiences, their faith journey, and how we can parallel and take comfort and encouragement through both their trials and their victories in their getting to know God. So that was all I had. Thank you.